What's up everybody, it's your boy Nate. We are back with another super exciting tutorial. You're gonna wanna take a look at that time right now because this is not a short tutorial. This is an in-depth walkthrough on how to use a green screen in After Effects. We're going from beginning to end, talking about how to film, how to edit, and how to avoid some common mistakes a lot of people do when they start doing green screen VFX.
In the high desert, oh, I'm gonna have to change. Look at this, a bummer. I thought it was light enough.
While I can't explain the boring technicals of green screening and chroma keying, I thought it'd be much more fun and helpful to actually show you the process as we go through one of my favorite uses of a green screen effect. Roll clip. This one also happens to be one of the most no budget shoots that we've done. So hopefully those of you who are just starting out and trying this at home, if you stick around to the end of this video, you'll be able to make something like this. Kick out your legs as high up into this.
Every day, 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 we got.
Anyways, I'm super excited. I know you are too. All right, let's go. Okay, so before we get into doing a green screen effect in After Effects, we need to get some footage, and that means what equipment are you gonna need to shoot? Now, a lot of people are gonna think that you need a green screen to green screen, which makes sense, it's in the name, but you can also use just about any color because green screening is really chroma keying, which pretty much just means that all the color pixels of a certain color we're gonna be making transparent. And in the case of green screening, it happens to be green. But when I was only 15 and I first tried this effect, I didn't have a green screen. I didn't have money to buy one. So instead I grabbed my blue bed sheet and I just used some clothespins to hang it up on the wall. And I was able to still get a pretty decent effect. So that's one of the first things that I want to point out to you guys is that with a green screen effect, if you don't have a green screen, you can actually get pretty creative and use different colors. Some of the most popular colors are green and blue, mainly because people don't tend to wear them when in front of the camera. And also those colors don't really show up in people's skin tones too often. Some colors that I would avoid though are yellow and red because without really realizing it, like these little parts of our fingertips actually have like a bit of yellow and red inside of them and even lips and stuff like that. So if you try doing chroma keying with a red or yellow background, you're gonna run into some problems if you're shooting a subject that's a person specifically. Now, one of the things that makes a green screen effect a whole lot easier to do is having great lighting. And of course, when I first tried this, I didn't have great lighting. But if you are pretty creative in where you set up your green screen or your cloth or whatever you're gonna be using for this effect, as long as you make sure that you don't have any shadows hitting the background, you should be in a pretty good position to do this effect without running into too many headaches. But for this effect that I'm gonna show you, we actually did not do that. And so I'm gonna also show you how you can work your way around having some footage that's not perfectly shot for green screening. Okay, so let's go ahead and get some footage. You're gonna see from this clip that Chriselle is on the right side and she's holding up what is a portable green screen, something that we bought from Amazon. I think it was like $60 at the time. I'll put a link in the description so you guys can go ahead and check that out as well. But also note that we are not in a professional studio. We have our talent here who is our friend. The person you see there lying on his back on the ottoman looking like what the hell is going on, that is our friend who's a musician. And I'm pretty sure a lot of you guys have some musician friend who's super talented and just isn't signed to a big label and has a huge budget to make music videos. So instead, they're gonna ask you to make whatever you can with your creative minds. And so this is what we came up with, which is having our friend lay on his back on his ottoman in his living room while Chriselle held this portable green screen up. The reason why he's looking like, what the hell is going on, this is pretty awkward, is because we told him to act like a roach, which as you can probably imagine is one of the most awkward things to do. But kudos to him for being a good sport and getting us the few slices of a second that we needed to make this effect work. Another thing that I want you guys to pay attention to is that we shot this in 60 frames per second because I wanted to slow this down into something more like 30 or 24 frames per second. And having those additional frames is gonna make the slow motion a lot smoother and everything looks way cooler in slow motion. All right, so now that this clip, I think we have what we need for this effect, we're gonna go ahead and hop right into After Effects. Okay, so the first thing to do is to open up After Effects, and we're gonna go ahead and save this project. That way the auto save feature kicks in. The last thing that you're gonna wanna do is edit for a few hours, and then all of a sudden you get an error message and After Effects crashes. You have to cry for like 2 hours, muster up some courage and do it all over again. So learn from my mistakes. Don't let that happen to you. Save your project in the beginning, so make sure your autosave is turned on. Once we have all of that nice and set, we're gonna go ahead and import that footage into After Effects. The way that we're gonna import this footage is by dragging it into the project panel. Kick out your legs as high up. Yeah. Bloop. And then we're gonna go ahead and drag the clip from the project panel to this little icon to create a new composition from the clip. Since this footage is much longer than we need, I'm gonna go ahead and also trim the composition. So the way I'm gonna trim this composition is by going up to the composition settings, and then I'm gonna rename it while I'm up here and change the duration to 10 seconds. I noticed that this is in 59 frames per second, so I also wanna drop this down to something easier to work with, like 24 frames per second. Once that's set, let's go ahead and click OK. Now I'm gonna drag the footage around in the timeline to find that perfect spot where he doesn't look like he's just flailing about, having no clue what's going on, and instead one that looks like he's falling in space, which might be a little hard to visualize, but I can move around the footage to get there. That perfect spot, it's gonna be dependent on whatever clip you're using. Once we have that set in the perfect spot and the timeline looks good, we're gonna go ahead and click on that footage layer, right click on it, go all the way up to Effect, Keying, and then Key Light. Key Light is a built-in effect that comes with After Effects, so you shouldn't have to pay for any premium things here. Key Light is one of the most powerful keying effects inside of After Effects. Now there's a whole bunch of other keying effects that you're gonna see there, but for green screen footage with people, this one just happens to be my favorite, especially when using green screen footage, and the thing I wanna key out is a person from a green screen background. In order to get this effect to work on the footage, we wanna go ahead and click on the screen color and use this little eyedropper tool, and then select on the green screen background. Instantly, you're gonna see it turn black, but let's click this button all the way down here to toggle the transparency grid, and we're gonna see that actually that black information is really just transparent, and that's how After Effects is showing us it. Now, I'm also noticing that there are some areas where the green screen isn't all the way keyed out, and so I wanna go over to the settings and I wanna adjust the screen gain first until it looks good. Now, don't worry about these specific numbers because it's gonna vary depending on the footage that you're using and how it was shot. This one in particular was a really difficult green screen because as you're gonna notice, there's all these little shadows in areas where the green is not completely flat. And so that's why I'm gonna have to adjust this back and forth. And again, your footage is gonna be completely dependent on however you shot it. So one way that I'm making sure that I'm getting some good settings in there is that I'm constantly going back and forth, toggling the transparency grid and scrubbing through the timeline just so I could see different parts of the footage and seeing how things are working out with the effect and the settings that I have set here. Now, once the screen gain looks kind of good, I'm still noticing that there's some noisiness, and I wanna just make sure that that noisiness when scrubbing through the timeline is lessened. Another way that I can help fill that in is by going to the screen pre-blur, which is pretty much gonna just take those little holes and noisy parts and blur them out, which is gonna make things look a little bit more feathered. So one thing that you're also gonna wanna pay attention to when doing this effect is making sure that that halo effect isn't super noticeable. So that's kind of what I'm doing right here. Next thing I'm noticing is that there's a little areas in the footage where the green has reflected onto his skin and just little parts of his clothes as well. So a super cool feature of Key Light is that there's an effect control right here called Screen Balance, which is gonna help us fix those areas where the green has reflected into the footage. One way we can also check to make sure that those settings are working is by going into the preview drop down, which is right here. And this is gonna help us get a better look at some of these difficult shots. So for this one, I'm gonna set screen matte. Then I'm gonna go down to this drop down menu and adjust the clip black settings. And then I'm also gonna go ahead and adjust the clip white settings, slightly adjusting the clip rollback as well while I'm at it. Once that screen matte is looking pretty complete, I'm gonna go click the view final result to get a final glance of how this effect is coming out. Okay, so this clip is looking pretty good, but once I started hitting play on the preview, I was noticing all kinds of weirdness. So I'm just gonna go back and adjust those settings, moving through the timeline while I'm adjusting the settings just to get a nice clean matte, at least as perfect as I can get it. I know some things aren't gonna be completely perfect, like these shadows right here underneath his legs. That's just because we didn't really have a big enough space to shoot or even as good a lighting setup to make sure that there weren't any shadows. But what we can can do is try to keep those shadows as transparent as possible, or even manually cut these out with masking. So next thing that we're gonna do, since this is looking pretty good, he's taken out of the green screen, we still have all of this border left over from the shot. Depending on how you shot it, you might not even have this, but since we did have a much wider shot and we knew that we're using a portable green screen, I'm also gonna go ahead and have to mask this out. So to mask in After Effects, we wanna go ahead and click all the way up here, which is the pen tool. This pen tool is gonna allow us to draw directly on the footage and create masks by just clicking points around whatever we want to mask. One thing to note is that you're going to want to make sure that your layer is selected. Otherwise, you're going to end up making a shape layer, which is not a mask, just like I did right here. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that. Make sure that I have that layer selected. Whenever we click and hold using the pen tool, it's gonna create lines that are curved. When you're working with footage in the composition panel, to get a better view of the footage that you're masking, you can scroll to zoom in using the middle wheel, or you can also middle click to move around the window. So that's looking pretty good. Some of these points I wanna adjust, so I'm just clicking Alt while I'm clicking on the handle, and that's gonna let us change the curve after I've already set the point. Once I'm done, I'm just gonna click anywhere else to continue. Now let's finish up this mask by closing up the loop. So this is looking pretty good, but I also wanna go ahead and add a few more points to this mask, which I can do just by clicking using the pen tool anywhere on the mask to add a point, or I can even delete some of the existing ones that I don't need by clicking on them and pressing delete, which is what you're gonna see right here. Okay, so for a still frame, this is looking awesome, except I wanna make sure that this works all throughout the footage. So I'm just gonna go ahead and scrub through this timeline again. And I think that's looking pretty good, but some of these points have to get deleted. So that's what we're gonna do right now. Now, I think I have it the best that I can with a static mask, but one of the super cool things that we can do in After Effects is also use an animated mask by going ahead and clicking on this layer and pressing M, which is gonna give this drop down. And let's click the stopwatch right here, which is gonna allow us to keyframe in After Effects. Now, if you aren't familiar with keyframing, all it is a point that holds information. So when we set a keyframe, you're gonna see this diamond shape appear. All that diamond shape means is that this mask looks exactly like this at this point in time. Now we can drag around this keyframe, and then as I scrub through and adjust the mask, you're gonna see a new keyframe get made. His neck right now moves a bit, so I'm gonna wanna go ahead and change the mask so that it fits to his neck, and then setting a keyframe and scrubbing through the timeline and making some more. Another cool technique that I can do is copy and paste some keyframes whenever I notice that he is getting into similar positions, at least by using Control-C and Control-V. And once that looks pretty good position-wise, I'm gonna wanna go ahead and also feather out the mask, which means to make the edges a little bit softer. And then I'm also gonna wanna push in and pull out using the mask expansion option. Now, if you don't see these settings initially, one way that you can pull them up is by double clicking on this arrow or by pressing M twice while having that layer selected. So this is looking pretty good. If that is all you needed to do was take out a person, then you are completely done and you have all the chops. But to really sell this effect, we're gonna need to put him inside of the background and hopefully have some sort of cool 3D camera motion and a background that's being related to it. So I'm gonna show you exactly how to do that right now. So let's go ahead and create a new comp, and I'm gonna name it. Let's see. Okay, looks good. And once I have that new composition, I'm gonna drag in that falling composition that I made earlier into this new one. The first thing that I wanna set is the 3D and motion blur. If you don't have these options, you can click on the toggle switches and mode settings down here, and it's gonna pop up with these little boxes right here. Another thing that we're gonna do is click on the layer and press PSR while holding shift, which is gonna pull up the position, rotation, and scale options. And the reason why I have these options pulled up is because we're gonna wanna animate manually this falling motion, kind of like we saw earlier. So to do that, I'm gonna set all of these keyframes by clicking on all the stopwatches. You don't actually have to click on each one individually. You can just click and drag and slide down, and it's gonna select all of the stopwatches at once. And then once those stopwatches are on and we see keyframes, we can reposition the person falling into a general rough location that we want the final location to be. And then I'm just gonna drag these keyframes all the way to the end and then right click the layer. While the timeline is still at the beginning, click transform reset, which is just gonna reposition it back to the middle so that we can go ahead and reposition him again all the way to whatever we want the first positioning to be. Now, this doesn't have to be super set in stone because you can pretty much just adjust it with these 2 keyframes. I notice it looks still pretty weird even with this animation set, and that's actually because we haven't slowed down this footage at all yet. And so in order to slow down the footage, I'm gonna right click on the layer and select time stretch. I'm gonna make this 200%, which is double the time, half the speed. And the reason why this works well is because earlier, as I mentioned, I shot in 60 frames per second for this very specific reason, which is to allow it to slow down by half, which would be about 30 frames per second and still looking good. Now, as long as we're not dropping below 24 frames per second, things should look smooth. So that's one of the things to keep in mind when doing an effect like this, is that slow motion can be one of your best friends. So as long as we're not dropping this anything below 24 frames per second, things should look smooth. For styling now, I want to make this a pretty cool black and white spacey effect like we saw earlier. To do this, I'm not going to click on tint like I normally do. Instead, I'm going to select black and white, which is an effect that you can find by going up to Effect, Color Correction, and then black and white. The reason why we're using this one specifically is because this lets us change the individual color channels. I know specifically that for black skin tones have a red underneath them. So what we want to go ahead and change is the red channel on this effect, which we can do so by adjusting this right here. We're going to go ahead and adjust these numbers down until he gets this nice kind of black spacey look. Then I'm going to go down to the other individual color channels and adjust them down as well, still preserving some of the highlights that we got earlier, but making sure that we get this sort of surreal looking effect. The styling is looking pretty good, but I'm noticing that the animation still looks like it needs work. That's okay, because I think things are going to come together a lot better once we add in a background to give us some spatial depth in there. So since I want this to look 3D, I'm going to go ahead and add a camera, which we can do so by right clicking right here inside of the timeline and clicking on create new camera. Next, I'm gonna click on the camera tool, which is just gonna let me click and drag around and zoom in and out and see how things are working in 3D. That's pretty cool, but we can reset this camera back to the original position. I wanna go to transform options on the camera specifically, and then set a keyframe for all these different options like transform, rotation, zoom, and whatnot. Next, we're gonna move forward throughout the timeline, and we're gonna adjust this camera to set a new keyframe. So this is looking kind of good, but we still don't have a background. So one of the things that you might have noticed from the final result that we used in the music video was that this background has particles that are moving around, and it kind of moves to the same motion of the camera, even though that motion is very subtle. And what we used specifically to get that effect was Trapcode Particular. Now this is a premium plugin that is super powerful. I've talked about it in the top 10 plugins for After Effects plenty of times. I'm also going to be leaving a link down in the description in case you guys want to get that as well. To use this plugin, we're going to go ahead and create a new solid. Let's go ahead and name it Particular or whatever. And I'm gonna drag this below all the other layers. That way it is pretty much in the background. And I'm gonna go ahead and right click on it, go over to Effect, and then RG Trapcode, and then Particular specifically. Now what's really cool about this plugin is that we get this side panel, which may have all these super crazy options that's honestly super overwhelming. So I love how they have what is instead a really cool intuitive UI by clicking on this Particular Designer option. Even cooler than having to make anything from scratch is being able to use the geniuses over at their design team who created this awesome set of presets. And my favorite is going to be one that hopefully looks kind of like a star field. Now this one looks pretty cool, but I noticed that it is quickly moving. I kind of want to slow it down, so let's go ahead and click it. Once that loads up, I'm going to go down and remove this quickly moving floor field with just this little button. That's gonna toggle off of its visibility. And then I want these other particles that are moving to be stationary. And what we're gonna do is go through the particle settings and change the velocity to 0. We're gonna also drop down that wind velocity that's over in the dynamic settings. Okay, cool. So now we can hop out of that and see how this looks. As I'm moving through the timeline, this looks better. It's following the camera motion, but these particles are not big enough. They're just not taking up the whole space to make it look like we're in outer space or whatever kind of world you wanna call this. this. One thing that we can do is adjust where these particles are. The way that I'm adjusting them is by clicking on the Z position and just moving that around. And then I'm also gonna go ahead and drag the layer in the timeline. That way these particles aren't starting from 0 and birthing new ones. We want these particles already on the screen. By moving the layer itself forward through the timeline, we're gonna be actually making it so that these particles are born earlier than our composition starts. So these are looking pretty nice, but another thing that we can do is adjust the emitter size with these XYZ options. And then I'm also gonna go ahead and adjust the position and size until it looks pretty nice. Now again, these are all gonna be dependent on whatever background you're doing or however you want this to look. So go ahead and have fun with it. I don't want you guys to be all tied down to the specific settings and everything like that, you know. Get something that you think works for the shot that you've done and whatever fits your creative vision. So these particles are roughly good, but I want to add a little bit more depth and texture to this background. And so what I'm going to go ahead and do is add a super cool trippy galaxy photo. I just pulled this one from Google. You guys pick whichever ones you want. So we're going to drag this into the project panel and then into the composition. I also want this to match the background and not have all these funky colors. So now this is looking pretty good, but another thing that I want to do to refine this background look is add a little bit more color correction to this. So I'm going to use one of my favorite effects. It's one that I've talked about actually on the top 10 effects. Actually, is the top 25 effects for After Effects. It is curves. This one is super versatile. You're gonna get this graph that looks like a linear line when you first start it up. But by clicking and dragging different points on here, you're gonna be able to adjust the highlights, the mids, and the lows of the image. You really get to play around with it. So you're gonna see I'm using a plugin called FX Console to allow me to just type in these effects. That way I don't have to go through the different drop-down menus. This is actually a plugin that I talked about on the top 10 best free plugins for After Effects. So if you want to see any other cool plugins that are going to help speed up your workflow, make sure you go ahead and check out that video as well. So right now I'm just clicking and dragging to adjust the mids and the lows. I'm also going to adjust the highlights a little bit. That's looking pretty good. Now the next step that we want to do is make this 3D. That way when the camera moves, the background also moves accordingly. Now that that motion is looking pretty nice, let's also add in a mask around certain parts of the galaxy. That way we don't get these super hard cut edges around it looking like we just slapped a photo in. We actually just want to pull out parts of this nebula and the different star debris all over the place. So I'm gonna just click and drag whatever kind of abstract form around this galaxy. And once that's looking nice, I also wanna go in, feather that mask out. That way we get this nice gradient transition into the background. And this is looking super nice. There's still just a few more touching up things that I'm gonna do here, which is adjust that alpha curve. And this lets us specifically adjust how that fall off of the gradient into transparency works. Again, all of these settings are gonna be dependent on whatever footage that you're using, whatever pictures that you're using. Another really cool thing that I love to add to this effect, to really just sell it, was to add a vignette around the borders. And so to do that, I want to add what's called an adjustment layer. It's pretty much a layer that is going to affect all the things that are below it. And so we can right click on the timeline, create a new adjustment layer, drag that all the way to the top if it's not already there. And then the next thing that we're going to do is click add CC vignette. Okay, so all of that is looking pretty cool. I think we have a nice galaxy. It's 3D, it's color corrected into the background. And now we have an asset that we can play around with. So let's go ahead and duplicate that galaxy layer by pressing Control D while the layer is selected. And I'm just gonna go ahead and move this around in the composition to a different position, maybe even adjusting the Z axis so it goes a little bit more in the background and we get this little depth that happens. Another thing that I'm gonna do is adjust the masks expansion, which is gonna make the galaxy not look like we just copied and pasted it, but instead, hopefully a little bit of variance is gonna get introduced in there. So things are looking pretty cool. Now, if you guys have an effect that you've spent so much time on and you wanna create a few other options, what we can do is actually duplicate that same composition and then just adjust all the keyframes that we did earlier so we get a few different options of how this falling animation looks. Maybe it's a zoom in camera motion, maybe it's a panning down. Really, the versatility is up to you once you have this effect set up. So one thing that I ended up doing actually after we had used this all the way in the music video, so the music video version is slightly different from this other one.
Every day, 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 every day. We got truth, sending my heart.
I thought about taking it to the next level and adding just a whole nother level by adding a cool lightning effect in the background. Now, to get this effect, I didn't want to spend a huge amount of time setting up my camera outside and recording at the perfect time. So instead, I use Envato Elements stock video, which has so many different assets and ones for me to pick from. It was honestly one of the things that just made this project so much easier to do. If you haven't heard of Envato Elements, they've actually sponsored some of the videos on the channel, mainly because they're one of my favorite tools for creatives, and they come at a super affordable price point. I think there's like a monthly model to where you get access to everything. I mean, everything in their library, from templates to stock videos to, honestly, like the list just goes on and on and on. But specifically for this, we're just gonna be looking at the stock video section. And what I'm doing right now is searching lightning. I have a few options, so I'm gonna go ahead and download this. And I'm just gonna import this once it's downloaded into After Effects. From there, let's import it into the composition. I'm gonna make sure that I drag it below all of the other layers. That way, it's definitely in the background. So this is looking pretty cool, but we wanna make sure that it's also set to 3D. That way, the lightning also follows that camera motion that is influencing all of the background and the motion in the scene. By default, this lightning effect has a bit of color in it, and it doesn't really match the footage exactly. So let's go ahead and stylize this the same way that we did the galaxy footage, by either making it black and white using the black and white color correction or the tint. Another setting that I'm gonna turn on is continually rasterize, which is going to let me move these particles in front and help blend in the footage. Depending on your project and how you set this up, you can play around with the ordering of the layers, which is something that I did right here, just to see how I wanted the blending to work. Did I want the lightning in front? Did I want it entirely behind? How did I want the person falling, the nebula, and the galaxy stuff? Yeah, it's honestly just a stylistic choice from then on. One cool thing that you can do if you have footage like this lightning footage and you want it to influence the lighting of the scene, we can drag it above the layers and then change this blending mode to screen. And if you don't get this blending mode off the bat, you can make sure that you click toggle modes and switches down here, which is gonna pull up that drop down. So here I'm just putting some final touches on this. Now, again, guys, don't worry about being super perfect with this. This effect is all about having fun and experimenting. So I'm honestly curious to see what you guys are gonna come up with. So once that's looking all nice and perfect, let's go ahead and render out this bad boy. To render this out, I wanna go all the way up top here to composition, and then I'm gonna click add to render queue. To change the settings for the render, we can click on this blue text here, which is gonna let me change the codecs. I'm just gonna keep this at the default QuickTime animation. I know already it's gonna make a super huge file size, but it's also gonna have the best quality, and for tutorial purposes, let's just go ahead and go with the best quality. Next, I'm gonna click on this other blue text and just give it a name and a save file location. And once that is all set, let's click render and bam, doop, 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 doop. Let's speed this up. Okay, cool. We are done. Let's go ahead and preview out this effect. All right, so that's looking pretty cool. Now, this recreation one looks slightly different from the one that we used specifically for the music video. That is completely okay, because I think both of them look super cool. So that is it for how to green screen in After Effects. Hopefully you now know what to look for when shooting a green screen, how to edit it, and how to even make some really cool space guy falling in After Effects. Now there are still a bunch of other ways that you guys can use a green screen, so definitely send in your results. I'm gonna love looking at it. You guys just completely killed it with the lightsaber tutorial and the fire and hand tutorial and the ride on effect. I'm super curious to see what you guys are gonna make now knowing how to use the magic of green screens. When you guys get creating in After Effects, make sure that you tag us on Instagram at BLACKMIXTURE to have a chance to be featured on our Feature Fridays or even our top 10 crazy After Effects videos. Thanks to everyone who has sent in your work. It was a huge pleasure watching it. Me and Chriselle were just mind blown looking at all the crazy stuff that you guys came up with. Let us know down in the comments below what other tutorials you guys are interested in. Yo, we hit 100,000 subscribers. We actually got the YouTube silver play button. Still have not opened it yet. It is in the box still. I wanted to shout you all out for subscribing, being a part of this community. It's like freaking amazing. When we first started the channel, we had no idea how many of you all were gonna be interested in learning After Effects and just all kinds of cool creative stuff. So to have this community is a huge honor, and we hope to make a whole bunch of more cool stuff that you guys are gonna enjoy. And for those of you who have not subscribed already, just make sure you do and click that notification bell so you don't miss out on any of the super cool stuff that we got planned for you guys. As always, I hope to catch you in the next one. Peace. What's up, oh. Holy shit, yo, my voice cracked. All right, we're gonna do that again. But this is going in the bloopers.